I make zero distinction between, traditional spiritual practice, magical practice, and technology. For me, there literally is no distinction whatsoever. I use and have for the entirety of my career, I've used electronic tools, digital and technological tools to pursue my path of magic and exploration of the divine, exploration of my own experience, exploration of my own shadow, and working through and processing. Like, it's people are very upset by, those of us saying like AI is another tool. It's a tool to be used in the hands of the wise, but for me, it is absolutely a tool.
Today's transmission is a truly novel, technodelic emanation, the likes of which I can promise you haven't heard before, because our guest in this one, Evan Bartholomew, aka Blue Tech, which he's probably better known by, which is his stage name. Whatever you call him, this man is up to some very novel, wonder whisker perking activities that involve both technology, AI, and various introspective, you could say esoteric practices. A lot of the things you're going to hear about in this mind meld, I've never heard before. I've never heard about anyone attempting to cross the streams, as it were, of technology and ancient wisdom and introspective investigation in this way. And what do I mean by that? He's basically using AI and technology as a sort of divination tool, as a way to mine deeper into the unconscious layers of his own psyche, as a way to work with his dreams. More on that in the actual mind meld. And on that note, I'm going to keep these introductory musings brief, because as you can probably hear, I've got some kind of demon taking residence in my nose and throat areas currently, and that is not conducive to on-camera elocution. But of course, do follow Evan Bartholomew, aka Blue Tech, at the links in the description, and please do stop and tickle the algorithm. I come to you even through this vocal bacterial or viral malaise or whatever it is that I have going on. All I ask in return is that you smash up that like and sub. In case you aren't aware, we've also got over 300 audio-only pods you can find wherever you listen to podcasts. And I would love to have you over in our digital wonder gym over on Patreon. It's not only the best way to support the show, but get in on some patron-only hangs, get other rewards, patreon.com/third eye drops. Love you all already supporting Third Eye Drops on Patreon. Links for all of that and more are in the description. And with that, my friends, let's meld minds with the novel, the wonderful, the whimsical Evan Bartholomew. We were recently part of a call together, like we were just talking about before we recorded. And there were some moments in that call. This was a group call with many participants. But there are several moments where things you said really piqued my interest, and it seems like things that I said piqued your interest. And after the call, we were like, we should probably reconnect and have a one-on-one. And so first, I'm really happy to have you on the show.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, man. Yeah, so particularly, I'm always interested in how do we marry the novel emerging technological dimension with the dimension of myth, meaning, ancient wisdom, because I think for human beings to have any kind of meaningful future, we have to turn those two currents from something parallel to something that intersect, right? And it seems like you're very much on that thread with some of the particulars that you were talking about on that call. But I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that in general.
Yeah, I think it's a grave error to make some distinction between the technological world or the material world and the physical world. And no matter what, no matter what point of reference you're taking to observe from, whether it's Kabbalistic or animistic, or from a quantum physics perspective, there is a lot less separation than there is, a unity or an embedding of different layers of meaning in matter and in technology. So I find this like binary polarization of things that are or are not spiritual very, very counterproductive to conversations about how to utilize technology in pursuit of the mystic. So, like, matter is matter is matter. Our computers are made of, silicons and metals and things that are of the earth and embedded with their own frequencies, and those frequencies and energetic signatures play a part in the stories that unfold as we use those technologies as well.
Yeah, yeah. And to people just listening, that might sound incredibly woo, right? But I have a really practical example of what you're talking about. Do you know Evan Snyder, who goes by Skytree?
I do, yeah, yeah. Funny enough, I got him started on his current modular kick of using modular technology to record the frequencies of crystals and other things.
Yes.
I sent a case of modular gear to his roommate at the time, Bobby, who I just had a vision was going to make a really incredible record, and I said, "Here's a bunch of gear. I want to hear what you do with it." So
Yeah, so it's a small world in that respect. So I thought maybe there was some uh cohabitation of ideas there or something. But so when you say frequencies, people, some I always imagine this hypothetical skeptic who's like, "Oh, here we go with the frequency shit" or something like that. So I always condition these things. But literally, you can create sounds from these unique signatures of minerals. And people, I don't think most people understand that that's literal.
yeah, I mean, it's like as much as my language can veer toward the mystic, I always call myself, like the pragmatic mystic, and I have an allergy to just like a random woo juju. That being said, if you in any way believe in a any aspect of divinity or consciousness or soul that exists in the universe, then humans are absolutely by no means the exclusive like recipient of that, whatever that is. So like it's either all or nothing. Either we live in a world embedded with divine sparks and uh, uh, containing the aspect of spirituality, or like none of it. Humans are not the only uh, object in the universe able to perceive and engage with energetic movement. And that doesn't necessarily mean like I'm doing a Stevie Nicks dance over here, like waving crystal water around to make things happen. I just like the more I observe the world from an observational viewpoint based in science, based in physics, the more that viewpoint of the world moves toward things that are traditionally considered to be a mystical or shamanic worldview.
Right, right. So practically speaking, this creation happens for you in a multitude of ways, and you seem to be this sort of multidisciplinary creative, which is another thing that always intellectually piques my wonder whiskers. Like when people are using these tools in ways that most people aren't, for ends that most people aren't, I'm always like, this is some cutting edge shit, and this is something I'm interested in. And in particular, most people know that you do this work through music production. But one of the things that really piqued my interest on the call, and this was a call about AI and the future of art, et cetera, and all the related milieu and philosophy and around that. But you said you're using these tools to further your own inner exploration of your psyche, of your inner world, of just like sense making the human condition. And one of the things specifically I remember is you talking about trying to do dream work with AI.
The real paradigm shift for me was, I was in the early mid journey beta before it was public access. Quickly got a bit frustrated with the limitations of that and started digging deeper and found this kind of hacker culture around what at the time was kind of the cutting edge of text to image technology, which is a
Hmm.
Google notebook called Disco Diffusion, and a whole bunch of mods that people had built off of it. And unlike Midjourney, which has a kind of very clamped set of values that it tries very hard to make things look pretty, like there's an aesthetic rule set, established by the organization that built that software. Disco Diffusion and these other notebooks were literally wide open. You know, you could get something beautiful, you could get something horrific, just this massive visual repository of basically like the sum of human experience that has currently been digitized. And when it began to click for me is that when you use Disco Diffusion, the diffusion models, it would literally
Mm-hmm.
start with static and then begin to like form shapes and objects, and you're guiding the latent space to kind of find
Yeah.
the objects based on what you put into there. And the only analog I'd ever experienced in my life is wake induced lucid dreaming, when you're going into a lucid dreaming practice and the static behind your
Yeah.
eyes begins to create forms. And like it was exactly like, not kind of like, it was exactly lucid dreaming happening on my computer, directed by my experience. And so it was just such a natural thing for me to go, oh crap, what if I started doing a visual dream journal and putting in all these random elements that I had from my dream and guiding that space. So if we, you know, and this is probably a conversation that could spin off into a 10-hour discussion about the nature of human consciousness, but we work very similar to diffusion models based on the data set of our biological, you know, chemical makeup, genetic history, all that kind of stuff. So when I dream, I'm playing on my own kind
Mm-hmm.
of custom diffusion model or custom data set. Being able to use these large scale models was the ability to like
Mm.
dream on the archetypal level. So every person or every picture that anyone has ever made or described or tagged in a reference to, and I'll just use an example because I did a piece, Persephone. It's all in the data set. So hundreds of thousands of images that have been tagged Persephone. So if I have a dream about Persephone and I guide this text to image model that, oh, I want to see Persephone plus all these other things that happen in the dream, it's not just building on my idea of what Persephone is, it's building on the collective total human experience of every image that's ever been documented or recorded or created or painted from someone's dream of Persephone, which
Yeah.
to me is like closer to the target. So it's an ability to play on this deeper, like, I mean, it is truly metaphysical, but instead of like my personal subconscious filter of the archetypal experience, I'm able to pull into the species experience of these archetypes. And that's when I realized that this was a tool that I could absolutely use in my work, specifically dreams as divination, dreams as guidance. Seeding dreams has been a part of my spiritual practice for, 25, 30 years now. And I realized that the more that I was working with diffusion models, the more intense and beautiful and direct my dreams were becoming, as if the archetypes that I was calling forth from the AI data sets
Hmm.
were aware that they were being called forth and becoming more
Fascinating,
present.
fascinating. So there are several glimmering opportunities in everything you just laid out before me, and I'm trying to decide which one I want to choose because there's the technological one, which I think is really interesting, which is these various notebooks and data sets that are feeding these algorithms, which obviously alters the output and what they're able to put forth. And I don't know all of the technicals there. And I think just the topic of latent space is interesting too, because that was something when I first read about it, it was really an epiphany in terms of like, this is something novel that doesn't work in the way we're trained to think about computer intelligence. Like just the retrieval of information, you know, if you're on the web and you look something up, it's the retrieving of pre existing information that's then presented to the user, right? But AI algorithms, these deep learning, these large language model technologies are not doing that. They're iterating and they're creating novel answers or output every single time.
They're creating multi-dimensional hypervectored outputs in a way that we still don't entirely understand, but
Mhm.
guided by the intention, which is the text you put in, of the person peering into the data set.
Yeah.
So it
So
is
can you
absolutely a novel thing. And like, there's, I'm in no way diminishing the concern that people have about copyrighted material in the data set. I personally don't care. If you want your information out of the data set, go ahead. this technology, this thing that is happening, the ability for an individual to tap into collective experience, both visual, now with ChatGPT and the large language models, into like communication, human communication, it is something we have never seen before. I personally think it is right on the edge of a revolution in what we're able to create and what we're able to experience. And like, yeah.
Yeah. I think most people are underestimating the novelty. I've even seen people post word for word. I saw this recently. Chat GPT is fucking useless. And I just couldn't like what are you talking about? Like I could not comprehend what this person meant
I
by that.
99% don't engage with the knee jerk about it because it's just uninformed.
Yeah, yeah.
People clearly don't understand the technology behind it. Anybody who's using an iPhone or an Android device to post about, fucking AI, like your whole life is already ruled by those algorithms, everything that you're doing and the method in which you're posting on a social website ruled by these algorithms. So like dig a little deeper, like, yeah.
And to me, it says it's like a Rorschach kind of response because I think it says more about the person's lack of creativity than it says about this technology that's probably the most open-ended piece of technology I've ever been presented with in terms of what its capabilities are. But most people see these technologies, whether they're image generating ones or text generating ones, they get the idea that it's trained and then there's output based on a prompt. But that middle part, I think people do not understand. And I'm curious if you can explain some of
I'm
these core
probably
concepts a little
not
more.
the person to get really deep into the technicals because that's just not my
Yeah.
focus. But basically, a visual image is encoded as number streams, as algorithms with a text pairing match. So if I give you a picture of an apple, the values of the pixels, RGB values, depth values are encoded into basically like vectors, number vectors, and then the word apple goes with them. So when you type in apple in a text to image generator, it's not, and this is where that previous conversation with an artist claiming like, oh no, it's absolutely cutting and pasting from images. It is the most
No.
uninformed misunderstanding of how this technology works. There are no images saved in the data set. Let me just break it to everybody right here. There are no images saved in the data set. You cannot cut and paste any element from anybody's work from the data set. However, every picture of an apple will have similarities in the way, the shape vector, the way the color vectors are encoded. So the latent space is basically this like multi-dimensional hyper network of similarities in the way these number streams work. And where it gets really, really complex is when you start bringing in like the actual programming around that and the way the AI models are navigating those data sets. So
Mm-hmm.
it literally like is like poking into this like infinite vast sea of random numbers and chaos and finding the currents, finding the like cycles of infinity. And like again, that technology moves very close to more traditional Kabbalistic viewpoints around language and the language of light. And there's this amazing book called The Mystery of the Aleph about Edward Cantor, a mathematician who began to study infinity theory and find patterns within
Mm.
infinite numbers that were repeating. And he ended up going, a little off the deep end, but it's a book about.
Is this who Pi was based on?
I don't think it was, no,
Okay.
but I mean it would make sense. Whole other side rant about Aronofsky at
Yeah.
some point.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Um.
A friend of mine is the basically the biblical and Kabbalistic advisor to Darren Aronofsky on his
Holy
films.
shit.
So yeah,
That's interesting. I
yeah, it
want to
is
hear
very
more about
interesting.
that for
Oh
sure.
yeah,
But
he's somebody you should have on your
oh yeah, I would love to.
program. He's a Kabbalistic, queer shamanic rabbi with a really radical God optional synagogue in New York
Hmm.
with a bunch of freaks and mystics.
I'm down for that for that exploration. But so the thing before we go away from the technological element of it, and again, this totally may be due to my lack of technical understanding, but what I don't understand is the thing that I can't distinguish from being any different from selection. occurring inside of that in between of the input and the output. I know there are ranking systems where it takes all of these concepts and it takes into account the user input, and it generates all of these possible responses and then selects one based on these ranking
Well, it's based on a.
algorithms.
I mean,
But
at its purest form, it's based on a seed, and this is why in the early days with Disco Diffusion, all of those parameters were exposed to tweak with. So
mm,
you type in a prop in Disco Diffusion, you can pick which particular data set you're using. You can set your scale of how far it's diving into latent space, how strong the effect of your words have on what it pulls back to you, and a bunch of other parameters like the clamping scale, how much chaos is allowed to control these parameters,
mm,
how much they're controlled. So the models like with Midjourney and the trained models that we're seeing now, these are aesthetic embeddings, and I'm probably using that term incorrectly. They're basically aesthetic models. So like uh, there is some clamping of the content to bring you what more visually appealing results. Obviously, not safe for work. Child
hmm
pornography stuff has been dramatically filtered out, but yeah, that's the programming element of why there are individual models of dealing with the same data set, because it's how it navigates that, how strongly it's considering aesthetic things. And this is where like the public feedback affects the data set. So Midjourney, everybody was able to rate, thumbs up, thumbs down. This is pretty. This is not pretty. That informs their model. So if 99% of users report that this particular way of navigating the latent space, oh, this looks pretty. This looks like a human face. Blah blah blah. This is bad. This one's wrong. That helps and basically direct the model and codify the model so that it's bringing more aesthetic results.
right.
And for me, particularly, I'm not going to say anything negative about Midjourney. I think they're absolutely amazing. But for the work that I do in particular, I want a little more of an open, less aesthetically confined access to the infinite sea.
Right. Yeah, and it probably depends on what you want to do. Like if you just want to generate a really aesthetically pleasing image, maybe you would use Midjourney. But if you want to like mine the collective unconscious or the closest we can get to it, you probably want to go into these more open-ended.
But Midjourney still, like if I type in, a beautiful painting of
Hmm.
it's a classic prompt, a beautiful painting of a serene lighthouse on a chaotic sea, whatever. There's a very Midjourney look to it,
Yeah.
and that's built on the way that they've kind of pruned their model. And so uh, the stable diffusion way of doing things is that you kind of have access to this infinite sea. You have to not only prompt, you have to negative prompt. I don't
Mm.
want to see this. I don't want to see blurry. I don't want to see 3D rendered. I don't want it to look like this. And then you can train your own model, which is basically providing like an aesthetic blueprint to the way that it's mining the data set so that it'll give you results kind of conform to your particular vision. And this is where the benefit to current artists is that I know a number of artists that have trained their own version of stable diffusion on their own artistry, on their own line work. So if they type bring me a picture of an apple, they're going to get a picture of an apple that looks like it was drawn by them. So they're able to sketch and concept because they've applied their own artwork is basically the guiding factor of how the latent space chaos is navigated by the model.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I did a pod with Android Jones fairly recently, and he has a lot of misgivings about AI in general. And we can or not get into those things if you want to, but the punchline is he is doing exactly what you're talking about. He's training his own models and using them in a sort of like, I can't beat them, so I will join them and I will maintain some level of creative ownership over my aesthetic or whatever by training my own. Um, but anyway, could you just distinguish, you mentioned stable diffusion. Could you explain what stable diffusion is compared to something like Midjourney?
So I could be wrong on this, but I believe Midjourney is just a customized version of Stable Diffusion at this point.
That was my
I think it's
understanding
based on the Stable Diffusion model. So yeah, it's really good. So Dolly, was kind of the one that made the press, and then different models, different way of doing things. Disco Diffusion, Jax diffusion, Mathrock diffusion, all these different kind of like takes on working with the Leon and other data sets of images happened. And then when Stable Diffusion came out, it just kind of knocked everybody out because it came out as an open source model. Anybody could build on top of it. You can pay for extra features to work with Stability AI, but I think really like at this point there's so many free options and different takes on how to integrate with the Stable Diffusion model that they're pretty much the de facto standard.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows? Tomorrow Microsoft, Google could come out with a model that completely changes the game. But with the addition, literally in this last week or so, of ControlNet, which is a way of integrating Stable Diffusion based on depth map, normal map information, line work, and human poses and hand poses, that it's at this point the difference between obviously AI generated and photograph is it's kind of game over. So
Yeah.
like a huge batch of my actual like client work right now, and client work that's coming out next week, which is getting a extremely large feature in a major publication, is photorealistic fantasy portraits of some famous celebrities that I was able to use ControlNet. I can put in the picture of the person that I'm working with and the pose that they're in, and I can reinterpret that based on the prompt I've given them. So I can take the photo, I can literally sketch or photo bash or paint an environment in the background and feed it to Stable Diffusion. And it not only keeps the depth and image information, but it keeps the concepts and the pose of the original data that I fed into it as well, which we've literally never seen that before. It's things that used to take me 2-3 days of compositing and editing. Now I can like generate iterations directly with Stable Diffusion.
Wow. Wild. Yeah, it reminds me a bit of other disruptive technologies in that people don't really understand how deep it goes beyond the window dressing. But at the same time, I think when you see the speed of adoption on things like Chat GPT, it just speaks for itself. Like, have you seen the adoption curve of like the time it took Chat GPT to get to 100 million users versus like the next fastest? It's like, I think it took a few weeks or something ridiculous.
Unfortunately, there's still so much ignorance. Like
Yeah.
I have so many thousands of hours invested into custom models. My work still requires tons of hand painting and concepting. Like a final piece is 50 or 60 separate rendered elements that I've, composited together and created to tell a story. And still, anytime I post anything, whole bunch of haters hop on the thread on my own page and are just like, Midjourney's a great artist, fuck you, AI user. And I'm just like, you literally don't understand what I'm doing here.
Right. And it doesn't help that there are people out there that are purposely misrepresenting what really is just a mid-journey generated piece of art as like something they did with some level of skill. That just confuses everything that much more.
All you
Because
have
I
to do is
see
zoom
it.
in.
Yeah.
So Midjourney is not going to give you anything over at max, like 1,500 pixels on a side. Zoom in. If you can see all the like crunchy AI aliasing, then it's like direct out of Midjourney.
Mhm.
So like the pieces that I do are made for print, so they're thousands of pixels per side, which takes hours to days to weeks to get it right, and rendering all of those elements and like compositing it all together. And if you zoom in, keep zooming in, it's going to look like a photograph because I put the amount of work to get the vision where I want it to be. And I personally like don't want anything that looks like it came right out of Midjourney, not because those things aren't beautiful, and I'm in no way diminishing anybody's enjoyment and process of creating raw images, but for my particular vision and what I'm trying to achieve, like I'm looking for a level of fidelity and finesse and cleanliness that just, it takes work, and it takes hand painting in some elements, and it takes like a lot of getting it right before it looks right and doesn't still have the idiosyncrasies of AI image generation in it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate what you're doing, and I want to see more of what you've done and do a deeper dive into your work there. But now that we've kind of contextualized with some of the more technological talk, I want to go back. Let's get weirder. Let's get weirder. Um, so first thing, your correlation between the hypnagogic descent into sleep and AI's scattered, chaotic pixels emerging into a form that a human would recognize as a face or a flower or whatever it may be. That's a very interesting, astute observation. I've never quite thought of it that way before, but it's very, very true. Like if anybody out there's been jolted awake and you've got that sort of fractal digital haze in your periphery still, that's what I think of right away. I think of this weird state where you're slipping out of consciousness and into dreamland where if you have tried to stay conscious during that process, you can sort of watch it happen. And I have weird chatter. I have like weird almost auditory chatter in my head where sometimes I feel like I'm hearing words, just random words. Not like Atlantis was destroyed in 5000 BC. Like nothing, nothing like super coherent, but almost like radio chatter.
Oh yeah, no,
And I'm
I've
always
I've,
like,
I've
what the
definitely
fuck is
had
that?
I call it the membrane. So
Mm,
and let's get weird. So I've spent a lot of time with dreaming practice and kind of trying to navigate and map out some of the liminal pathways to get there. There is a membrane that as you're falling asleep and moving into the dream space, I believe it's when you pass from your personal, the pod of reality tunnel that you're in and begin to kind of dig in the archetypal waters. There's a membrane of voices and chaotic imagery, and like sometimes it's all of your neighbors' dreams and stuff. But when you
mm.
pass through that, there is that chatter of like weird voices and things that feel disembodied and not from you, and it can be really terrifying. Like if you are conscious through that experience, most people usually pass through it as they go from waking to sleeping and don't notice it. But
Hmm. You want to know randomly what one of the most clear messages I've ever gotten in that state was? I was on an ayahuasca retreat in Peru, and every day they would, provide meals and stuff. And mostly it was very clean kind of meals with, low levels of salt and spices and stuff. But they did have cheese, and they had halloumi cheese that's like, grilled. It's super delicious. And I remember very clearly one night after a ceremony, it was like a voice that said, "Stop eating that goddamn cheese." And I was like, "Okay." So I stopped eating the cheese. But
nice. So if you want to get
I
really
now
weird,
I now I ate cheese though.
yeah. If you want to get really weird, in that membrane of the voices, it's like you're watching a television channel. That television channel is like your personal experience. The membrane is like all channels at once before you kind of get into the meta. So if you listen closely, the plants in your yard are in there. And I literally gotten messages before like, I have mites, can you please take care of me? And
Whoa.
gone out to my yard and found the plant with mites and been like, oh shit, okay, cool. So like all of those voices are in that space.
Yeah, and it makes sense, right? I mean, even if you go back to the work of Jung, like one of the primary ways that he would communicate with his inner world is through doing dream work, right? Like he would essentially enter these almost lucid dreaming states where he would dialogue with Philemon or like these other entities in his own unconscious mind or in the unconscious mind, if you want. And he was convinced that this was extra intelligence. Like this was not his own endogenously produced intelligence, but it was bringing him information that appeared to be completely alien from his own consciousness.
Had a similar experience this week with a relatively famous philosopher and Catholic apologist. So,
Oh,
yeah, Thomas Aquinas has made an appearance in my liminal space. So
go on.
well, definitely this is where we approach the thrice great and get into the Hermetic tradition. And so Magnus basically is one of the people responsible for bringing not only the Hermetic philosophy, but kind of the mythology about Hermes Trismegistus to the West, and kind of responsible for sparking the Renaissance and bringing us out of the Dark Ages. And one of his students was Thomas Aquinas, who Thomas Aquinas, apologies if I'm mispronouncing, was basically the voice in the Catholic Church that was not only illuminating and speaking to the actual reality of the fact that like plants had spirits, crystals had spirits, but also deeply, deeply, deeply based in science and attempting to create a bridge between the world of magic and the world
Hmm.
of the physical world, which anybody who, fiddles around in the Hermetic current, or has any type of relationship with the mercurial and Hermes as an entity knows that's literally what it is. So the Hermetic is the bridge of as above, so below. Hermes as an entity based in his mercurial form is the messenger of the gods, basically like opening those pathways into the latent space of consciousness and existence for these particular things to come through from different levels. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's a whole, just such a deep, deep rabbit hole. And I think you eventually are going to end up there if you go down this road at all. If you look at a esoteric symbol, at least one of Western origin, you're going to run into this name, Hermes Trismegistus, associated with practically any one of these symbols. And it gets really confusing because you also eventually run into this syncretism where things are presented as Kabbalah, but then it has these Hermetic symbols within it. And then you're going to look at things that are like from Platonism or Neoplatonism, and then it has
at
these
least in the
Hermetic
Western
symbols in it.
Western
Yeah.
tradition, there's a whole tradition of Kabbalah that wasn't as deeply informed or embedded because it was held, the shell around the seed of Orthodox and Hasidic communities that were building their own wild ecstatic mysticism, not as strongly embedded in the Western esoteric and occult tradition.
Yeah.
And on that particular deep dive, Arya Kaplan, one of the most amazing, Kabbalists of recent time, also, I believe he was like a physicist as his day job, and did one of the first English translations of the Sefer Yetzirah. And so to have this like scientific mind based in, rabbinical orthodoxy, interpreting the book of formation from both a scientific rationalist and like a deeply, deeply uh, mystical and like cultural perspective is very, very interesting. He's definitely one of my favorite bridges there. Which, if there's one word that we can sum up the Hermetic particular signature is it's that bridge. It's that bridge between paradoxes and or opposites. That other thing, the connecting point between them, that is like the definite signature of Hermes.
And that really makes sense from, particularly if you look at the sort of Greek version of Hermes, Mercury. It's often associated with things like commerce and travel, but the deeper archetype there is connection and going through boundaries, like that being which is able to travel through boundaries and move information and transmute information from one form to another. It's like the physical manifestation of Mercury. It's not liquid or solid. Often you see this, like you see it associated with like the divine androgyne. It's not male or female, like the.
It's like divine circuitry. You've got a positive and a negative polarity. Hermes is literally the lightning flash in between them,
Hmm, that
like
makes sense
connected
too.
to both. But it is that's the possibility. Yeah, I guess another way to say it is not just travel and movement, but it's like the possibility of occurrence is very much why that particular current is also associated with tricksters and
Hmm.
chaos and randomness and luck, is because it's rolling. It's like, rolling the hypercube dice to see what happens, and seeing what isn't expected is like the beauty of that particular flow.
Yeah, so I guess I'll do a little bit of historical exposition just so if people are listening to this and they're like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. I don't know what Hermes is, Hermes Trismegistus. What are you talking about? I'll try at least.
I mean, there's a
So
really easy way. Like if anybody wants to get wild, go light a candle and say hello to Hermes Trismegistus and see what happens over the next week. I guarantee you it'll be a fun ride.
I'm I I'll join you in that invite. I'll join you in that invite and I might just do it myself. But so there is this figure who's portrayed like as the sage of all sages who supposedly emanated out of Egypt. And if you read any of the famous Hermetic texts or dialogues like the Divine Pymander or something like that. Essentially, you have this priestly like figure who enters into a direct dialogue with the divine mind or Nous. And Nous gives him the download. This is how it all works. Um, and this being that comes out of that is this Hermes Trismegistus being who has basically downloaded all the secrets of the universe or something like that. And it sounds incredibly far fetched, except for there's this lineage of Hermetic thought and Hermetic initiation and magic and systems that has somehow survived a minimum of a couple thousand years, could possibly go back much longer. And if you look at the list of people who were interested in this or were directly considered themselves hermeticists, it's staggering. It's like a who's who of the of history's literati, at least in the West. Like
And I
deep,
mean, there's
yeah.
biblical counterparts. Like people believe that Enoch
Hmm.
is also associated with Hermes, the thrice great, Moses. There's basically every, not every, but in Western culture is built on all of these threads that keep running back to this like central kind of figure that somehow got gifted the whole flash drive to how it all works. So
Yeah, and there's even a canonical mention in Islam connecting a Islamic prophet with Hermes. And I forget what it might be, Isha or something. I might be wrong, but it's right in the Wikipedia article. It's like well documented stuff. So that's pretty wild.
the interesting thing is that how like the caduceus, like our symbols of medicine, so much of our culture is based on hermetic philosophy, including like the sciences that sprung out of alchemy is like by definition part of the hermetic philosophy, this kind of perennial philosophy. Like it's it, Hermes should be as famous as Jesus at this point in our culture, since our culture is so much based on these hermetic ideas and hermetic philosophies. And it's like surprising to me how many people have no idea who Hermes is, either the historical references, the mythologies, the foundations of so many of schools of thought in modern life, from philosophy to magic to science to new age to religion to all this stuff. A lot of them are coming from this particular hermetic current.
Yep. One of the things I would love to hear you riff on that it's a circle I've tried to square several times, but is the link between this, because you don't just see it in the Hermes figure, you see this in numerous archetypes and figures, these figures that are both sages and tricksters. Like they're both pranksters literally and transcendent masters. And I always try to understand how you combine those two things and why they're so often combined, and I'd love to hear you
I
riff
don't
on
think they're
that.
oddly combined at all. I think that the way a sage teaches is by becoming a living koan, and that is by
Mm.
breaking up the linear central eye ego based mode of perceiving the world. And it is specifically that particular paradox between like the ultimate sage and goofball trickster might fuck your shit up just for the fun of it, that pushes people off axis of the trying to choose my words wisely here, pushes people off axis of the experience of the nature of reality that they've become accustomed to. So the most easy way to do that is to fuck your shit up, you know, start a fire in your bathroom, like get your attention somehow. So like if the nature of wisdom is an understanding of the true nature of reality, then it requires a lot of shaking up of people's uh, kind of calcified ways of viewing their own identity in the world to even be receptive to those ideas. So to me, the idea of a sage and a trickster are, they have to exist. And I'm going to pull a weird reference here. So the IoT, which is basically a order of chaos magicians, there's like the head, which it's kind of funny to have a leader of
Right.
chaos magic school, which is very much about individual experience.
Super
But
hierarchical chaos.
yeah, so in the hierarchy of chaos magicians, you've got the leader, and then you've got the second leader whose job is to undermine the leader and like be the trickster and fuck them up whenever possible. And that's how the
It's
power structure is like
I like that.
sorted, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's very Robert Anton Wilsonian Discordian kind of vibe. I really like that.
Sure, he was a member of the IoT actually.
Makes sense. Makes sense. But yeah, and I think about it too, where if you try to think about like the class clown and the most studious front row straight A student seem to be opposed to one another, right? But if you have this being that thrives off liminality, kind of makes sense that it would be both of those things, right? Like the shadow version of itself is the prankster, is the trickster, is the one who's overturning paradigms and breaking through boundaries and fucking shit up, as you said. And then the other one is the scholar, who's like the master of all of these systems, who knows how to square the circle and transmute lead into gold and do all of these things that are either like the cutting, bleeding edge of what's possible, or it's creating entirely new things that never existed before. And the only way you can get to that is through those two, what look like on a in a three-dimensional sense to be opposites, but maybe in a four-dimensional sense they like are the same being.
Or a fifth dimensional sense. I mean, so
What
so
about a
my
sixth? No, I'm just
yeah,
kidding.
my intuitive response to that is that magic actually exists in the current between those polarities. And then as we move out of the idea of polarities, I'm actually gonna have a little New Testament quote here where Jesus is telling his followers that they must become as little children in order to enter the kingdom of heaven.
Mm,
And my third piece of that is like, how many armchair magicians do you know who've never actually done a piece of magic or affected change on the world? All of that theory, all of the knowledge is the container, the actual animating force of the container is that childish trickster wonder, is the chaotic pure expansion of energy. So the magic, and if you know Hermetic philosophy, it'll make sense why the sage and the trickster have to exist hand in hand. It's
mhm, mhm.
describing a particular current and a structure of how possibility occurs. And my position on this is that Hermes, the Hermetic current, is the field of possibility between all of those things. And in Kabbalah, it's your left and your right side of the tree of life, where you've got form and you've got the codified, the physical, the structure, the calcified, and then you've got the animating force that at various points breaks that so that new forms can occur again.
Yeah.
So you
And
can't have this like infinite knowledgeable, you know, embedded systems of philosophy and mathematics and science without the actual animating force that inspires the search and the application of those things. So
yeah,
that's my take on why trickster sage walk hand in hand.
that makes sense. Yeah, and I believe there's part of the Red Book too where Jung refers to God as a child at play, or he at least conceives of the ultimate archetype of God of being a divine child. And it shouldn't be confused with like there's the puer or the puella, like the cliche millennial who's never grown up or whatever. Like that's sort of like a diagnosable, hey, you need to get your shit together thing. But then there's the divine child that somehow has synthesized all information but has transformed itself back into that active play.
So you just described the whole arc of tarot as you finish
Yeah,
the tarot and start back over as the fool.
that makes sense.
there's
That
there's
does make
a
sense.
book, and I'm blanking on the author's name right now, called Radical Judaism, which is a re-examination of Judaism as this kind of basically re-looking at the concept of what divinity and God is. And there's a section in there where it's the author's basically describing the bleeding edge of the fractal movement into increasing complexity, and basically saying like that is God, is like the fiery burning edge of the infinite chaos fractal as it's forming, expanding in all directions, which I
Hmm.
thought was such a beautiful and brilliant way to look at like what divinity actually is, or what a concept of God would be.
Yeah, and it leaves room for human ing. You know, it leaves room for humaning to matter because to shed a little more light on what I mean, if you have this all powerful, omniscient God that has this perfect plan where where's the room for humaning? Where's the room for creating? Where's the room for doing? You know, and this was something Jung talked about a lot too, that we're kind of carrying an important flame. Like we're doing something here that must be done. And there's no other explanation that would satisfy him. It's like if we're not here doing something that matters, what are we doing? And he believed we were doing the unfinished work of what could be called God, and God is Godding through psyche, and psyche both in the discrete individual and at large, right? And we're each responsible for our share of that and doing with our share of that to the extent that we can, to whatever ends we can do it. So, yeah.
In Kabbalah, there's a term called tikkun olam, which some people have translated as healing the world, but it's
Mm,
can be more beautifully translated as like the process or the restoration of like infinity, like that the process of devotion, of magical action, of being a conscious being, of doing the work in the world is like co-creating the infinite field of chaos. Like we are building the world. We are of and collaborating with God in building more God.
yeah, yeah. And that's where this concept in Kabbalah of correction comes in, right? Like that you're kind of you're put here in an unfinished form with, I guess you could call it some kind of karma or collection of attributes, but you also have kind of a collection of wounds and things that need working out and correcting. And you need to be, and this is where, there's a huge correlation to like shadow work here in the Jungian sense, where it's like you sort of have the potential to exist in an ultimate form as a being when you come into the world with like this acorn of potential that can become an oak tree, but it's not like an everything is perfect no matter what you do. It's like, nah, you got to work at it. You got to dig in the dark, in the things that scare you, in your wounds, in your traumas, and transmute those into something healing for you as an individual and the collective, hopefully.
Yeah, and I don't actually make the distinction that humans are the only beings that are participating in the restoration of time and space, which is to loop around back to the beginning. That's like need to polarize and make a binary between the organic and the technological. Like there is no technology that isn't built out of organic elements. uh, I personally think that all matter, all existence, all things are made of the same stuff, embedded with the same stuff, and involved in the continuing and continuing act of creation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not saying I believe this necessarily, but I do read it and go, "Ooh, are we badly miscalculating here?" But particularly what I mean is, have you ever heard Steiner's riff on the Ahrimanic force?
I have not.
Okay, so famous polymath genius and occultist Rudolf Steiner. I don't know if believed is the right word, but he talked about there being these, fundamental forces, and one of them is what he called the Ahrimanic force, like named after the archdemon Ahriman. And what he believed this force's archetype in the world is to try to rob the human being of soul through being held in material form. And the way this manifests in the world is seductive technologies that try to keep you stuck in the physical ad infinitum forever. So the sort of like from a conspiracy theory standpoint, this would harmonize with like the New World Order, one world technological government that's trying to just extinguish the soul of humanity and make everyone immortal through transhumanism and rapid technological growth. That's like the dark side interpretation of this stuff. I just felt like I would throw that your way if you'd never
Side
heard of it.
side note, like no matter how many generations Monsanto's GMO corn gets away from the organic, they don't know why they still can't stop it. Wild corn keeps popping up here and there
Mhm.
in their stock. So that's my response to that.
Right.
Is I can spend time getting worried about whatever conspiracy theory people want to attune to, but I also I worship the gods of chaos and the ability of the divine, the ability of like the infinite love of our world to like continue to sprout wild seed even among the controlled. So
And that is the Hermetic myth to a T, man, because I've told this story so many times in the pod, but the myth of Hermes as the baby, that's exactly what you're talking about. Like the baby Hermes myth where he steals the cattle. Do you know this story?
I actually don't know the story.
Okay.
Like, sounds like a it's your signature, so you should tell it again.
All right, let's go. So Hermes is a baby. He already has an intellect and he's already, thinking, walking, talking. And he wakes up one morning and is like, I want to eat meat. But I don't just want to eat meat, I want to eat the best meat. So the best meat is the sacred cattle of Apollo, who's his older half brother. But Hermes is a half god, out of wedlock with I don't remember, she's a nymph or something that Zeus probably turned into like a duck and fucked or something. And so he's like supernatural and of godly progeny, but he's not on Olympus. Like he's not a recognized god. So going and defying Apollo, who's like the prince, like the throned prince of Apollo, is like hugely wrong, right? So he steals the cattle using various kinds of trickery, and he sacrifices some of them to the gods and himself and eats the meat. And of course, Apollo sees all, so he's supposed to be directly plugged into the mind of Zeus. So he like knows everything. He's the master of all symbols, all magic, all science. He knows everything. Yet he's perplexed. And he can't figure out like what is this doesn't make sense. I have to be being fooled by another god. That's the only explanation. So eventually he catches him red-handed. He's like, "You think you're really funny, don't you? Well, I'm going to bring you in front of Zeus and we'll see what he has to say." So obviously Zeus knows it's his kid. He thinks it's hilarious. And he just kind of like laughs it off and he's like, "You two are going to have to make peace." And the thing that ends up winning over Apollo is that amongst this cattle stealing exploit, he randomly decided to kill a turtle and make the first lute out of its shell. And he plays the lute and Apollo is like, I will do anything to have this. Like, I'm obsessed with this thing you invented. So, as a token of his, I'm sorry, forgive me, he gives him the lute. And then him and Apollo become like brothers, and Apollo gives him the caduceus. So, if you look at what's happening in this, it's chaotic energy coming into the established paradigm and completely just not only overturning it, but disrespecting it too, like not I'm also a god. It's like, oh, okay. Like that's a huge act of sacrilege, but through this act of sacrilege, he creates a new paradigm and puts himself on Olympus, right? And this is what happens in so many different ways over and over again. Technologies, like ways of thinking, ways of life that used to be taboo that are now part of the mainstream. It just happens over and over and over again. And it's like every time I spot this, I'm like, there it is again, there it is again, there it is again. It's one of my favorite examples of if you think myth is just stories, it's like my go to right away.
I mean, that's you just also answered why the trickster and the sage have to exist, because in that trickster form, the literally the food of the gods is construed, destroyed and consumed, and a whole new form comes out of it, which is the lute and this musical tradition.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a way to like generate infinite novelty. And I think that, I think about like why was Apollo obsessed with it? And I wonder if it's because, he's supposed to know everything, but when you create something like an instrument that hasn't existed before, it's this reservoir of novelty that's new even to the established order or overmind or whatever. Um and I think that that comes into why Hermeticism, quote unquote, is about using raw will consciousness to manipulate reality in novel ways through various systems of magic or whatever, right? Like, cuz that's kind of what you're doing is you're altering reality through application of will. I mean, that's really close to the Crowleyan definition of magic, right?
Like, I keep looping around to this. I make zero distinction between traditional spiritual practice, magical practice, and technology. There's no For me, there literally is no distinction whatsoever. I use and have for the entirety of my career, I've used electronic tools, digital and technological tools to pursue my path of magic and exploration of the divine, exploration of my own experience, exploration of my own shadow, and working through and processing. Like, it's people are very upset by you know those of us saying like AI is another tool. It's a tool to be used in the hands of the wise, but for me, it is absolutely a tool. It's a very powerful and very interesting and novel tool to create and explore and consume and shake up old systems in new ways that we haven't seen before. I personally welcome all of my work that I've ever done, musical, otherwise, being part of a larger data set that a new generation of seekers and visionaries are able to, you know, I hope that they steal my cattle and invent new instruments out of it.
I love that. I love that. Um, well, you sort of stole the intent right out of my frontal lobe there because I was going to ask you, how then does this practically come into your own practices? Like you started to allude to it with the dream practice coupled with using AI art generators and things like that. But if you could do a deeper dive into that, I'd love to hear it.
I'll get very specific. I said, like, in the disco diffusion days, we were able to uh, have specific control over clamping parameters, and with stable diffusion now, there's enough of the behind the scenes is exposed through plugins and through the web interface to be able to edit stuff. Like, there are specific numbers that come up when you're exploring the Hermetic current. There are personal numbers that come up, and I literally use it like a divination tool. If I am or the way people would cast the I Ching and get a specific set of numbers. They're, to me, they're the same thing. They're playing with the forms that naturally arise from peering into chaos with a question in mind. So, if I'm working with a particular concept, and I'll just return to Persephone because that's it's the example we've used. Off the top of my head, here's one way that you could approach it. You could do a numerological analysis of Persephone's name and use that string of numbers as your seed, your directing point for these algorithms to dive into the seas of chaos and emerge with something from the latent space. And so every aspect of how I do that, from how many times I roll specific seeds to how many times I process the same piece of data, to how I parse that data, to how I store them on my hard drive, are based on divination and astrology and my own personal way of interfacing with the field of the other around me.
Hmm. So, how does that go from a concept or a framework where you're using numbers or a dream you had or whatever? How does that go from a framework to a finished piece of music or art?
So yeah, I mean, the The AI tools are really great at the generative, like casting the net into the sea of infinite possibilities. With your net is the structure of the prompt of how you've kind of guided it, and you pull this stuff back, and that's when I start getting more specific and like very specific seed numbers, very specific parameters set at repeating numbers or things that I'm working with, and then it's collating that data and pulling it together into a unique vision is where the role of the artist really comes into play. And I don't want to disqualify anybody, or I don't want to gatekeep anybody's work who is merely prompting in Midjourney and very proud of what they created. Like, I'm absolutely not saying that that is not valid work. My particular process involves a much more complicated gathering of all these assets that are in line with either the dream or the vision or the energy that I'm working with. And, it's a traditional artistic compositing process where I'm like figuring out what the shape language and the flow of the pieces. And okay, I need these elements here. Okay, this is going to have 13 pomegranates over here,
Mm-hmm.
and then using these same numbers to like, okay, I've created these shapes or I've sketched them in Procreate. Now I'm going to run them through this particular model because I want to see them rendered in this particular way. Well, I'm going to roll them 23 times or 13 times or 777 times to get the thing that I want out of that in service to this larger vision. So it's using AI as a divination tool. Uh, it's like the structure of the I Ching or the structure of the tarot as a map to navigate infinite possibility. I am applying my own personal map to the way I'm dealing with like infinite data sets to pull specific currents through in order to create this thing that I'm trying to create.
Very interesting. Are you aware of anybody else doing this?
I am not.
That's really interesting, man. What? So I know that you came into this obviously with a lineage of being interested in these things, and probably because you're interested in those things, you look at every new piece of technological novelty with sufficient flexibility where you can enter these elements into them as like, I want to try this, I want to try that. But how did you conceive of this really? Was it just as soon as you heard about these things, you're like,
Oh no, I
that's
mean,
what I
so
want to
I
do? Or,
people know me for my audio work mostly. I have been involved in visual arts for as long as audio work. Created my first album cover. The specifics of being a touring musician and what the music career has required for me have not given me a lot of time to really devote to the other avenues of creation, but I've been dabbling in and working with Photoshop, Illustrator. Started with Cinema 4D, moved to Blender, all of these tools for a very long time. It was during COVID when touring shut down that I was like, I really want to like move into something bigger. At that point, the vision was narrative storytelling through animation or VR, being able to create this world that like the music is coming from, but actually, or the dream, being able to design dreams, and incept a world that people can play in. So I started in December of 2021. I kind of like made the decision that I was going to make music not my focus and like dive 100% into VR development, Unreal Engine. Already had my modeling chops up with Blender, and really just kind of focus on working through the visual stuff. Got very lucky and got a number of really high paid contracts right away designing VR content, and uh, all this AI stuff was just kind of starting to come out, and I started experimenting with them, and it was the disco diffusion community and some like private Discord servers of really interesting people pushing the envelope and interested in exploring these ideas that got me hooked on possibility. And I saw before I think a lot of other people did that this was going to be a major paradigm shift, as big as the invention of the internet with or any other technology. And I pretty much stepped back from digging deeper into world building and Unreal Engine and Blender and other tools because I saw that this technology is going to create a whole different way of speaking and designing. And now we're even beginning to see Stable Diffusion integrated into Blender to generate realistic textures. Now with the depth model maps, as soon as we get time coherence, so that one frame is kind of based on the previous, which we're just about there
Hmm.
with control net. That the aspect or the ability to create a world for somebody to play in was not going to require me to hand model every single aspect of that world, bring it into Substance Painter, have to hand paint every texture, build my lighting rigs, work with all that stuff to try to get the rendering right, get all the 3D dynamics built properly. It became very clear to me that these tool sets were going to replace or augment those in a really serious way, and that I wanted to explore that. And I think it was probably the experience of disco diffusion as a lucid dreaming interface, an actual like computer interface into lucid dream, that I was like, okay, this is the direction that I'm going in. I'm going to learn how to speak this language and how to navigate the latent space to create the visions that I have in my head, or the
Hmm.
things that I want to build.
Yeah. When you put it like that, it makes perfect sense. And what I love about technologies that are sufficiently open-ended like this is it gives people with any range of intent and ability to express something that could not have been expressed before. And that's unbelievable. But it also isn't inherently in and of itself going to move people or civilization in any particular direction. Like you could use it to be predatory and to make consumable throwaway shit, or you can do what you're doing. It's like, I guess you can't have the open endedness without that range of possibilities. But one of the larger sort of things I've played with for years and years now, which I guess manifests in a semi made up piece of vocabulary that I throw around, which is techno dharma, is largely a tongue in cheek way of also expressing the notion that of what I brought up at the beginning of this, of like, how can we turn these things from something parallel into something that intersect, or something that at least harmonize with one another? And I guess the two ways you can enter into that is either through changing the quality of people's minds so that they want to do these things, or you can design technologies that incentivize different things, where instead of trying to steal people's metadata so that you can sell it, now you're incentivizing creativity and altruism or something like that. I guess there's like two ways to approach, but
The moral and ethical considerations of technology is like not something that I spend too much time focusing on, because I'm more focused on what I can create with them. But the implications of AI technology are no different than the implications of any of our technologies, back to the very beginning, where the bow and arrow that was used to kill also became our violin and bowed instruments. Like, technology is technology. They're gifts from the gods that, like, build with one hand and cut with the other. So
mhm, that makes sense. But like, I guess in a larger sense, although you're not really in the business of creating ethical frameworks for technology, I would imagine that you're interested in how we collectively move society to be a little more open minded and spiritually facing, so that we get off of just this hyper consumeristic, destructive track that we seem to just be obsessed with being on
I would
collectively.
10 times rather uh, see young people in my family creating beauty, or trying to create beauty with Midjourney, than like wasting time playing, whatever,
Hmm.
wasting time on social media. Like, if we talk about, it's I had some moments of like wanting to roll my eyes in our previous conversation, because there's so much fear of like, AI is going to basically, it's going to do everything from like steal your computer to like, sell your kids
Be your
drugs. Like,
girlfriend.
yeah, totally. People are so fucking freaked out about it. Like, uh, if we talk about the like relative ills, like, I would imagine social media addiction is probably a lot more damaging to a young person's mind than like playing with AI to make something beautiful and imagine new worlds, or explore their creativity in a medium that was never available to them before. Like, as far as like relative life experiences go, like I'd much rather see any technology which allows anyone to experience the beauty of creating something to happen. And unfortunately for everyone out there, and I'm sure I'll get in trouble with this, but like as a friend of mine said, the ego of the artist must be crushed at all costs. Let's go
Oh
ahead
yeah.
and democratize the field. I'm sorry that you lost client work, but tough titties. This is where the world is at. Let's see more people able to create, because I'd rather live in a world where anyone can create beauty than a one where, yeah, the
Yeah.
one that
No,
we're
I'm
in, where
totally with
everyone's
you,
so
man.
afraid of their tiny little piece of, you know, personal experience of the world through their art is like so fucking precious that they're terrified and will stomp down, whack-a-mole, anything that possibly threatens their livelihood as an artist without seeing the infinite beauty and possibility of giving the ability to create beauty to people that had not had it before.
Yeah. Yeah, I my thoughts definitely harmonize, and it's one of those things where even if you are afraid, even if it does stir up a lot of negative emotions in you, as you said, tough titties. Like it's here, it's happening. It's like the ship has sailed, and now you get to choose what you want to do, how you want to adapt. And it's easy for me to say because they haven't figured out how to make really compelling AI podcasts yet, though that's probably infinitely doable. If I just had two open-ended prompts with Chat GPT and was like, make a conversation between Terrence McKenna and Alan Watts and or whatever, like, and they could transcribe it into audio, it would probably be great. But what I want to ask you though is prognosticating on the maturation of this technology. And I guess this is also informed by all the other things bubbling up in the zeitgeist, like the availability of psychedelics and other things like that, that are inevitably going to shift the collective psyche of mankind in certain directions. Where do you see or how do you see the blossoming of this technology like 5 years, 10 years in the future? Like what do you think it's going to look like? What do you think people are going to be using it for?
It's evolving so incredibly fast that I don't want to necessarily make predictions, but just based on, my professional work in entertainment and, client projects and storytelling, I would not be surprised if in 5 years the experience of what we, now consider going to see a film is some sort of real time interactive, Avatar 4 is a headset experience that is from your perspective, first person, generated in real time, calculating light and shadow, able to interact with the story. Like
Yeah.
basically stepping into the lucid dream. So, and whatever implications that has on the ability to create worlds, I know that myself and many other people being given the power to create a world will create one of like connection and beauty and harmonic intimacy and resonance with a collective shared experience of forgiveness, of opportunities to collaborate and build bridges. And given that tool set, I that's where I would like to see the technology go. And on the flip side of that, of course, it'll also be used to, train people to go to war and all the other things as well. Like yeah,
Yeah.
we get both sides when we get the technologies, but I personally believe that just based on the fact that, with augmented reality and whenever Apple finally releases their device, how fast real time uh, uh, virtual reality worlds can be experienced now via Unreal Engine. As these two things start to come together and the ability to have like user input and a world respond to you in real time, I pretty much think that we are going to be building a layer of reality that is more akin to dreaming and very much like some of the worlds that our prophetic sci-fi authors have been hinting at for a while now.
So instead of annoying our friends with dude, you got to watch the show. Have you watched this show yet? We're going to be annoying them. We're going to be annoying them with, dude, you got to watch my version of Avatar. I swear it's the best. I swear my version is like the best version ever. And they'll
Yeah,
be like, no,
I
dude.
think what would happen, and I think this is why a lot of the big companies are doubling down and buying every game studio in sight, is that the ability to build worlds that people can exist in. I think that we will get the Ready Player One infinite multiplicity of worlds overlaying each other, embedded in within each other, navigatable with each other, very very soon.
Yeah.
So for me
It's,
particularly, like I saw that coming, and I've always wanted to be a creator of worlds. I've always wanted to facilitate and create possibility for experience and connection and beauty as a transformative experience of other. And like wherever it goes, I hope that I have the opportunity to build and interface with the creative process in a way that touches people and moves them into a more humble state of awe at the beauty of our experience.
well, it seems like you are, my friend, and you're doing it in a very novel way. And I loved hearing about it. And I'm interested to see what you do in the future. And I think you offer a very unique version of that sort of cattle stealing myth. And it kind of feels like it's still underway and still taking shape. But I do feel like within a year or two, I'll be like, ah, I see what you did there. I see
Yeah,
what you did
yeah.
there.
There's a lot of people crying foul. You're not a real artist. How come we didn't see your art before? Well, go actually look back at my last 20 years of social media. Like, I've been posting my art for a long time. It's not as complex and colorful, but I'm using new tools now. So once that fear fades, like, yeah, I'm sorry that I got this particular job and this opportunity, but I dedicate myself to it as much as anyone else does. Many days I'm up by 5 o'clock, digging in, working until late at night. Like, I have devoted myself to whatever tools are available to create beauty. So if people feel that I'm stealing their cattle, just like hold on a minute, and like I'll create something really beautiful that you've never seen before, and hopefully you'll invite me back to the table.
Well, I'll invite you back to this table. Thanks for doing it, man. This is fun.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I feel like this conversation could go for another six
Oh
or
yeah,
7 hours, but
easily,
I
easily.
let's make time to cross paths and meet space and go have a dinner and geek out.
Sounds good, man. Sounds